Slightly different tonight. I'm going to start with a reading I'm going to come back to later on during the sermon. And it might feel like an odd reading to kick off a service, but anyhow, I'm going to read it. It's from the Song of Songs. I'm going to read it. I'm going to invite you to stand. We'll pray, and then we'll begin in sung worship. But if it does seem like an odd reading, it's because we have been working our way through each book of the Bible in a big Bible overview series, and we are in Song of Songs tonight, and it's the passage during the talk that I'm going to say, let's just hone in on some of these verses. So, it's Song of Songs, chapter 1, and verses 8 through to chapter 2, verse 7. If you do not know, most beautiful of women, follow the tracks of the sheep and graze your young goats by the tents of the shepherds. I liken you, my darling, to a mare harnessed to one of the chariots of Pharaoh. Your cheeks are beautiful with earrings, your neck with strings of jewels. We will make your earrings of gold studded with silver. While the king was at his table, my perfume spread its fragrance. My lover is to me a sachet of myrrh resting between my breasts. My lover is to me a cluster of henna blossoms from the vineyards of Engedi. How beautiful you are, my darling. Oh, how beautiful. Your eyes are doves. How handsome you are, my lover. Oh, how charming, and our bed is verdant. The beams of our house are cedars, our rafters are firs. I am a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys. Like a lily among thorns is my darling among the maidens. Like an apple tree among the trees of the forest is my lover among the young men. I delight to sit in his shade, and his fruit is sweet to my taste. He has taken me to the banquet hall, and his banner over me is love. Strengthen me with raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am faint with love. His left arm is under my head, and his right arm embraces me. Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and by the does of the field, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires. Father, we thank you for these words. We know, and we're going to be learning tonight, that they're always going to be taking us back to you and the scandalous, outrageous love that you have for us that we don't deserve, but you lavish upon us freely. We praise you that we get to spend time tonight together thinking about that love, the love that spans time. Bible. And tonight we're in Song of Songs, hence why I started with a reading from Song of Songs, and we'll come back to that a little bit later in the talk. But for now, I'm going to start by asking Toby to put a clip on, which I found quite funny in preparing for tonight's sermon. So, if you're ready.
Hold it right there. Are you tired of your secular pickup lines not working on the girls at church? Are you striking out every time? Well, boy, do we have a product for you. Song of Solomon pickup lines. That's right, Song of Solomon pickup lines. Did you know that from the original Hebrew, Song of Solomon is better translated, how to win godly women? Really? Not really. But that doesn't mean it doesn't work. That's right, Song of Solomon pickup lines. 60% of the time, it works every time.
Well, me and Chad met a few years ago, and he just really won me over with his words.
Yeah, before Ashley, I tried a lot of secular pickup lines, but finally I went to Song of Solomon pickup lines, ordered it, and I mean, first try was Ashley, and here we are.
He told me my neck was like the Tower of David built with elegance. I really didn't know what he was talking about, but I knew it was from the Bible.
We've had top-ranked biblical scholars comb through the original text and pick out the best pickup lines for you. With our product, you'll get gems such as...
Baby, your hair is like a flock of goats leaping down the slopes of Gilead.
Girl, your navel is a rounded goblet that never lacks blended wine.
Hey, boo-boo, Your nose is like the Tower of Lebanon looking towards Damascus.
Are you tired of only being the brother in Christ? Get out of friend zone and call 1-800-Song of Solomon Biblical Pickup Lines now. That's 1-800-453-219-465-217-910-465 now.
Okay, bizarre. Here's an image. Roger, you sent me this image of what she would look like if all of those pickup lines were featuring on this beauty from some Song of Songs. Why have we got a book supposedly about pickup lines in our Holy Bible? Some of the stuff in here reads as fairly erotic. It's different from 50 Shades of Grey, but erotic nonetheless. Why is it in here? Big question. Good question to ask as well. From the outset tonight, I want to say it's because love and marriage and sex, they're all incredibly precious gifts of God and from God, and he's the best teacher on these topics. Sex is so precious. It's to be protected by binding oaths in the marriage ceremony, and many of you will have heard me speak on this in a not too distant series, so I'm not going to go back into a lot of detail on that tonight. But right at the start of our sermon this evening, there are two attitudes towards sex, and it features in the Song of Songs. There's two attitudes that I'd like to dismiss as wrong, just plain wrong, right at the outset of this overview, because otherwise I don't think that we're going to fully appreciate this beautiful book, Song of Songs. Firstly, first wrong attitude. Over the years, many have thought of sex as just filthy, carnal, shameful, cheap. The ancient philosopher Plato drew a strong distinction between the spiritual and the physical, with the physical being unimportant and bad. And this dualistic view sadly permeated the church and much of the early church. Some of the early church fathers, they even castrated themselves in a bid to be more holy and flee the sinful smear of sex. Now, as an aside, I often chuckle to myself when it's mostly blokes, and in our sermon series I did mention a parental filtering software called Covenant Eyes, and I've heard blokes say to me, I don't want to do that, it's too costly. And I think it's like $7 a month. Cheaper than castrating yourself. Some, back then, the early church fathers, they even taught that Adam and Eve did not have sex before the fall. How could they do something so bad in the perfection of Eden? They asked. One church father, this is, I think, quite amusing. One church father even said that Eve would become pregnant by eating the fruit of one of the trees in the garden. Definitely not by having sex, because that thing didn't happen in the perfection of Eden. Fascinating. As a result of such teaching in our fallen world, the early Christians were commonly taught there was just one sole reason for sex: procreation. Definitely not pleasure, just procreation. And don't forget it, because sex is bad. And such a low view of sex, it seemed to clothe much of Victorian England. You will have heard and read snippets of history. I remember reading one story of a Victorian couple's wedding night, and it really sad reading. The groom entered his bedroom to find that his wonderful Christian bride had drugged herself to sleep for a few hours, and she had left a note to her husband saying, "Make the most of tonight." That's a really, really low view of sex, and yet that was bubbling away within the church. And if you're thinking that sex is low, you have a low view like that, then I want to say, as I've been saying, that's wrong. If sex is something that only brings shame for you, then I'm deeply sorry that that's the case for you, and I hope that you're able to drink more fully of the truth that Jesus is able to rid all of us of any shame. I hope that comes across tonight as well. More recently, some of the couples that I've kind of counseled through marriage counselling courses and things, I've heard that many have the lights off, when they have sex because they don't like the look of their bodies. Again, we're going to see in Song of Songs, that's a low view of sex. In Song of Songs, we're going to see that sex within marriage is to be celebrated, it's to be enjoyed, not merely endured or dismissed. And it's where, God-glorifying sex is where lovers can see one another and enjoy what they see. Anyway, that's one wrong attitude. And the other wrong attitude I mentioned, too, might be more pertinent today, is sex being God. Sex as God. Sex is everything you're living for, all that you want. And many people today, many kids today are worshipping sex. We had the sexual revolution in the 60s, but again, this isn't really a new thing. Back in the New Testament times, the Apostle Paul wrote some letters to the church in Corinth, and they were plagued. We read about it with sinful attitudes to sex. Ancient Corinth was an extremely sexualized Greek society where sex basically involved worship. There were said to be 1,000 temple prostitutes in ancient Corinth. And those attitudes in years to come were constantly banging on the church's defenses. And some of us would say, it's the same today. Our society says that, and teenagers have told me, the pressure they have towards the end of their school life is that unless you're having sex regularly, then you're a weirdo. I want to say very clearly, that is a lie. It's a lie. Jesus was the perfect human being. He never married or had sex. Trust me, we really need to learn from this beautiful book, the Song of Songs. And from my experiences traveling around the world so far, rubbing shoulders with other denominations, other parts of God's church around the world, whenever a church has been wounded, this is my experience, so I'm not saying it's 100% true, but whenever it's stopped meeting or halved inside or lost passion or become bitter, 99% of the time it's been caused by some kind of sexual scandal or maybe a marital upset in a significant couple in the church. And it's sad. And it might be that the word sex or love, sadly, or marriage, it fills you with hurt. You might feel that you've come along tonight and just thinking about this book, you didn't know we were studying it. You feel robbed of love, or maybe you feel unlovable. And I just pray that tonight you will go away knowing how much God loves you, and that love might become a beautiful word once again. And that we all might remember that despite how these things might have been wronged for us, that sex and marriage, they're beautiful gifts of God and his creation. Now, interestingly, procreation isn't even mentioned in this book. Instead, the lovers in this book, they revel in the pleasure sex brings, and it's deemed wholesome and good. Intimacy as God planned. Now, before having a brief look at those verses that I mentioned, which I hope will find the romantics amongst us swooning, I want to offer one final word of introduction before I launch in. And this is important. Some read this book merely as allegorical, and by that I mean that they read this book as though the two lovers featured, and we'll come across the two lovers, are simply Christ and his bride, the church. Now, personally, although I'm going to rave about that reading, I don't think it's the sole understanding of Song of Songs. And my reasoning is young Jewish boys weren't allowed to read this book until they came of age. And I guess we'd be asking the question, well, why? If it's merely allegorical, it's all about Jesus or the Messiah, why wouldn't you be allowed to read this book? So there has to be something more in the book. Maybe there's also a plain reading, and we read those words, do not awaken love until it so desires. You can imagine an 18-year-old Jewish boy, I don't know, it was 16, 17, 18, maybe it was younger, maybe it was older. Whew, okay, whew, this is passionate stuff here. I need to be careful as I read this. Having said that, others have read this book as though the plain reading were the only reading. In other words, it's merely an erotic love poem between two lovers who wed and celebrate their love in the bedroom. And the danger here is some fairly illicit sermons, and I mean illicit sermons, get preached. And I don't think that they would be all too fitting here at All Saints Peckham. And I say that with a pinch of salt, because for those of you who were helping out with Alpha last year, I did actually catch some people at it by the wheelie bins just out there. So, you know, I say it's not fitting in here, but such is life in Peckham. I'd like to suggest that this book is both a plain love poem, so we will understand and make sense of the erotic, the love, the passion, and so on, celebrating the intimacy of two lovers who marry, but it's also an allegory of Christ's love for his church. Inevitably, I think, because all the Bible's words are Christ's, they're always going to take us back to him in some way. And I want to be honest and say, believe it or not, it's actually taken me a while to fully appreciate that, the allegory here. Even in my kind of pastoral ministry, it's taken me a while. I've held the fullness of God's love at arm's distance. I've kept it for me a kind of contractual, a head knowledge because I've seen it written down type of love, because that's allowed me to keep my perceived masculinity. You know, I can remain an alpha male without having to sing those endless Christian worship choruses where I'm telling Jesus how much I love him and what a great boyfriend he is. Actually, from beginning to end, the Bible is absorbed with marriage. It begins with Adam and Eve, it ends with, between Christ and the church, marriage. And it's not just a contractual, we'll keep this very polite kind of love. No, God has a passionate, sexualized love towards his people. And it may well be that that makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. That's fine. It did to me at first. But then I realized the distinction between love and lust. And sadly, our sexualized love is always tainted by lust. Not so for God. Perfect love. And he passionately loves us. And it's sexual because his love includes every part of us. But it's wholesome. There's absolutely nothing that he wouldn't do for his bride. You love Jesus, you're his bride. Anyway, that's a really long introduction. Introduction over. That's the God that we're going to be introduced to in this book. So, we're going to begin. We're going to come to those verses in a minute. Just brief word on chapter 1, verse 1. Solomon's Song of Songs, the first 4 words. We're told in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 32, that King Solomon wrote 1,005 songs. And yet here in verse 1, we're told that this poem here, this book, is his best song. That's what it means when it says Song of Songs. It's akin to saying the song of all songs, the top of the charts. The Bible quite often does this, isn't it? Lord of Lords, the Lord of all lords, King of kings, the King of all kings. They mean the best in their category. This is Solomon's best ever song. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's all about him. I guess it's a possibility. But we're to read this poem as though it could be anybody and everybody, as though it could be us. Personally, I like to think this is about Solomon bearing his heart for all to see, head over heels in love with the woman of his dreams. And you'll know that obviously Solomon went to have a lot of wives and concubines. So maybe try to think of that as later on in his life, just for the time being. I think the book, in parts, plots a development in the relationship. They think about one another to start. They speak to one another, and it builds up to their wedding in chapter 3, and that's the moment that binds the whole of the book together. However, after that, I kind of lose any sense of chronology. And I think that's fine. In fact, I think it might even be the author's point. For those of us who've ever written love letters, you'll know all too well that chronology, it really does not matter in any way, shape, or form. The main objective in a love letter is love. My wife wants to hear, "I love you, darling." You're amazing. She didn't really care about dates and times. She wants to know I'm missing her. For what it's worth, some have suggested that this love story is a 3-character drama featuring the woman, Solomon the king, and then the shepherd lover who really has the woman's heart despite all of Solomon's advances. Now, that is potentially there, but it isn't my take. I'm not too sure that Solomon would consider this the best song he'd ever written, the Song of Songs, if it were the case that actually the woman was into another guy. Likewise, as a teacher of wisdom, I doubt very much that he would set himself up as this villainous lech. For me, the 3-person drama doesn't really work, but I'll leave that up to you as you lose yourself in this great love story. So, chapter 1 then, verses 8 through to chapter 2, verse 7. And these are the verses I read earlier, and from these verses, I'm going to pick out 4 very brief lessons on how to cultivate healthy, loving marriages, and then 1 disclaimer at the end for those not yet married. And yet, in each of them, I'm also going to provide something of the allegorical understanding as well. So it's for all of us, regardless of whether we're married or single, divorced or whatever, regardless of our Facebook relationship status. Doesn't matter. Firstly then, seek to be endearing. Seek to be endearing. The translators in Song of Songs in the Bible have helpfully given us little titles throughout the book to let us know who's speaking when. Under the titles, in the NIV it's beloved, friends, lover. In some other translations it's she, he, and others. So look at what the man says, verse 8, chapter 1. If you do not know, most beautiful of women, follow the tracks of the sheep and graze your young goats by the tents of the shepherds. Now, just before then, at the beginning of this chapter, we see the woman asking to see her fella. She was telling him to keep some slots in his diary free for lunches together, coffees in the middle of busy days, secret rendezvous. And here in that verse, he's telling her where to find him. Keep on following that track up by the sheep. And it's good. He's giving her access to his diary, his whereabouts. Nothing's kept secret. She doesn't need to worry at all about his affection. I have a friend who, when he was courting and then into his marriage, in his diary, he used to write the words tied up when he had a coffee or a date with his wife. And so somebody would phone him up saying, oh, there's an appointment, can you go to the hospital or wherever it is at this time? Look in his diary, sorry, I'm tied up. And wouldn't say any more. But I thought that's wonderful. It's prioritizing time with his spouse. It's endearing. But the lover here also speaks in endearing ways to his wife. It's not just that he creates time, he speaks to her. He says, oh, most beautiful among women. And you'll have seen that she does the same for him. And if you like, oh, most beautiful among, these are nicknames, but they're endearing ones. They're ones which only they use for one another. And so for the married here reading this, we need to ask ourselves, do we have endearing nicknames for our spouse? Or do we use names which cause embarrassment? And then for all of us, just pause for a moment. Can you imagine how Jesus pronounces your name? Have you thought about that before? Can you actually imagine him speaking your name out loud? Which letters would he emphasize? Because he knows your name so well. And when he speaks it, unlike anybody else in your life, when he speaks your name out loud, he fills your name with meaning. Seek to be endearing. Secondly, seek to be respectful. Look at what the man says in verse 9 of chapter 1. I like this. He says, I liken you, my darling, to a mare among Pharaoh's chariot horses. Your cheeks are beautiful with earrings, your neck with strings of jewels. I'm going to unpack that in a second. But when I say respect, I mean to think highly of. And there's no question in our minds as to how highly this chap thinks of his woman. He's full of respect for her. The woman, with reference earlier on in the chapter to her darker skin, bronzed, tanned from laboring outside under the sun, it's in verse 5, that perhaps signifies a kind of working class background. She's got calluses on her hands. She thinks lowly of herself because the wealthier women, they didn't have to work in the blistering heat of the day. But her man won't have any of it. He attributes to her the respect that only those wealthy non-working class women from the city would receive, who could afford the fine jewellery, the ornaments, the jewels, seen as treasured possessions in the Old Testament, symbols of wealth, prestige. And her fellow's saying this. He's saying, forget about those other women. That stuff, it looks best on you, my dear. What about the mare imagery? Ladies reading this, would you like to be told that you look like a horse? One commentator suggested this means, like a horse, she had big haunches suitable for child rearing. Delightful. I think we can understand this imagery in maybe slightly more helpful ways. A mare is a female horse, right? Whilst all the cavalry of Pharaoh's army were made up of male horses, stallions. He's not just saying that she sticks out from the crowd. He's saying that she drives men wild. Pharaoh's army would have been thrown into disarray if a nice, mare had just started strutting her stuff amidst all the stallions. People would have been thrown off the stallions' backs, neighing, grunting, stamping of feet. She drives men wild. To be respected by the one you love the most says more than 1,000 words ever could. Again, look at what she says in chapter 2, verse 1 and 2. She says, I am a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys. Interestingly, she's not actually speaking very positively of herself here, since apparently roses were fairly common in Sharon, a low-lying coastal plain, like lilies were in the valleys, very common. And so her lover, he steps up, verse 2, and he brings a corrective. He says, like a lily among thorns is my darling among the women, the young women. He's basically saying, my love, don't do yourself down. Don't disrespect yourself. If you want to call yourself a lily, that's fine. But in that case, every other lady is a thorn. That's why I'm mad about you. He seriously respects his woman. And vice versa, verse 3. She says, as an apple tree among the trees of the forest is my beloved among the young men. He stands out to her. He's fruitful like an apple tree. He's edifying to her. Now, there's loads of ways we could apply these verses. But first and foremost, are you seeking to be respectful if you're married to your spouse? How are you respecting your spouse? Are you speaking to your wife, your husband, with respect? So easy to, if you've been married a long time, to just get into a rut and forget your P's and Q's. Is it obvious that we respect our spouse with our actions? Picking them up from the train station late at night without that look of frustration, praying for them, encouraging them in their faith. And we could apply those lessons to all of our relationships as well. It's worth saying that spouses, even the strongest marriages, we will let one another down. We will hurt the ones we love the most. And it's worth saying to those not married or those who've sadly been widowed that we will all feel disrespected at times by those we thought friends. And ultimately, we will all be left wanting if we're only fully seeking respect from other human beings. If we're seeking to find our identity in other human beings, at times, that identity will feel very shaky. Now, we're all going to do that in some way or another because that's just our natural default. But it's a shaky place. Jesus, however, he respects us. And despite all of our sin and shame, our wrongs in our relationships, be it marriage or just friendships, he respects us despite all of that. He doesn't point the finger at us or condemn us. No, he's molding us, he's shaping us, and he wants to hold his his brothers and sisters up to the world and he said, look, these are my chosen ones. Friends, that's respect. Thirdly, seek to protect and build up. Look at what the woman says in verse 13. My beloved to me is a sachet of myrrh resting between my breasts. My beloved is to me a cluster of henna blossoms in the vineyards of En-gedi. The nard and myrrh mentioned in her words here, they're both expensive fragrances, which this working class woman maybe couldn't afford, but she knew what they were. They're attractive to her smell. Maybe she'd seen them in the marketplace, smelt them in the marketplace. That's what her lover is to her, lying between her breasts, which, plain reading of the text, could evoke sexual undertones, but more likely, I think it's close to her heart. He has a place in her heart. One of the reasons I struggle with only going down the allegorical route, though, is that you get, again, some commentators saying things like the myrrh here represents Christ and the two breasts, the Old and the New Testaments. Now, I'm not too sure how you get there. It seems like extraordinary guesswork. The Bible never seems to provide that reasoning. So I do think we need to be, treat our interpretation with some care. En-gedi, though, just focusing on En-gedi for a few moments. Some of you will have maybe traveled to Israel and you would have been to En-gedi, but it's this beautiful oasis in the desert region by the Dead Sea. And again, that's what her lover is for her. En-gedi, he's rest, protection from the blistering sun, rest, recuperation with the fresh, cooling oasis water. And again, applying this in our own lives, do we feel protected at home? Are we built up and replenished at home? Is home En-gedi? Or is home just more of the desert, like the office, more chores, more discouragements, more criticisms? Got to make our homes En-gedi for one another. Or at least provide En-gedi for our spouse when we know they need it. Some tips, turning off our mobiles at dinner time, removing our laptop from the bedroom, clearing the kids' toys off the bed before our spouse has to, running him or her a hot bath when we know there's stress. Are you En-gedi to your spouse? But then also when we come to church, let's apply this more widely to other relationships. Is En-gedi? Is church En-gedi? Are we En-gedi to one another at church, encouraging one another when we can just see it on our faces when we walk through the door? They've had a tough week. We're more likely to be En-gedi to others if we've each treasured Christ in our own hearts and let him be our En-gedi. I remember hearing one lady say, the thing I love most about Rob is that I know he loves Christ way more than he loves me. And at first I thought, ooh, sounds quite harsh. But actually then I thought more about it and I realized it's beautiful because he's going to be a much better husband to her if he keeps on going to Christ as his En-gedi, offering that same En-gedi to his wife. This week, it may have been a long and stressful week for you. I said to a friend recently, I feel like I'm sinking at the moment. There's so much going on. There's so much coming up. I just feel like I'm sinking. Where do you go when you feel like that? Emotionally, maybe, when you feel empty, at breaking point, where do you go? Christ, who is En-gedi in Matthew, he says these words, doesn't he? He says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Friend, today, once again, Jesus has his arms stretched out, open wide, and he's saying, come to me. Let me embrace you. I haven't gone anywhere, I'm not going anywhere, just come back to me. Recenter yourself in me. And he'll bring peace. Fourthly and finally, seek to romance. Let's have a read of chapter 2, verse 3 to 6. Like an apple tree among the trees of the forest is my beloved among the young men. This is the woman speaking. I delight to sit in his shade, and his fruit is sweet to my taste. Let him lead me to the banquet hall, and let his banner over me be love. Sustain me with raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am faint with love. His left arm is under my head, and his right arm embraces me. This woman, in the words of Beyonce, she's drunk in love. She's faint in love, verse 5. Literally, all her senses are involved in this passionate relationship with her man. There's touch in verse 6. There's sight all over, with chapter 1, verse 16 being a good example. There's smell, chapter 1, verse 13. There's sound with numerous complements so that she feels a banner is raised permanently above her, speaking of his love for her. There's taste. No wonder she's faint from love. Her love tank is full. And as a result, she just loves life. She knows she's loved and she loves life. The author, Gary Chapman, he speaks of 5 love languages. I'm sure you may have heard of these love languages. Words of affirmation, quality time, receiving gifts, acts of service, physical touch. And we are each different. So each of us will have different love languages, but it's our job, if we're married, to find out our spouse's love language. It might be different from our own, and make sure that we're filling it up on a regular basis. Seek to romance. But now the allegorical. Think of God's passionate love for his people. We're told in the Bible numerous times of how God sought to woo and romance his people Israel out in the wilderness. It's why I talked earlier about God's love embracing the sexualized love as well. We're told how he's jealous for his people's affections. He wants you and me for himself. Why is that particular thing happening in your life right now? Nobody else knows about it, but you know about it. Why is it happening? Why is it maybe that you keep on waking up in the middle of the night? It just keeps on happening. Why is it that you've come to church tonight when actually you didn't think that you were going to come out at all? Could it be that this God has wooed you into doing so subconsciously with a charm that's gone below your radar? Just a thought. And then finally, the disclaimer for the unmarried. 4 lessons for the married and 1 disclaimer for the unmarried. Show restraint. Chapter 2, verse 7, our last verse. And this is the lady speaking, I think, to her friends, to her girlfriends, her mates. And she says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and by the does of the field, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires." And she's basically saying, look at what this has done to me. I am living in a permanent daze. Love is a powerful thing, and it's going to take over all of your life if you let it creep in. I can't stop thinking about him. Be careful. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul talks about the unmarried having more time on their hands to serve the Lord than the married. And in one sense, that's true. The unmarried don't need to worry about date nights and clashing diaries and taking kids to the schools and parenting meetings. And I thank God for some I know, and some we will know, we've read their books, who felt a strong call from God not to get married. And they heeded Paul's advice, and they've been able to give themselves to deep theological study and leading churches and working in the secular world as well, and pursuing things which they would have found much harder. They were also giving good quality time to spouses. But the lover here, she's not just talking about the extra time you'll have being single here. That's not what she's getting at. She's talking about the dangers of uncontrolled passion. The healthiest context for sexual intimacy, according to the Bible, is marriage. And she's warning her friends of the dangers of of just allowing love to creep in, of getting carried away, maybe in the bedroom too, before just coming to that point of utter commitment. I remember as a teenager hearing these words: to tiptoe around the boundaries of sex with your girlfriend, Greg, is to take a Ferrari for a drive when it's only got BMX brakes. It will be impossible to control. And I thought that was quite a powerful image. God is a good God, and he wants to protect his children from hurt. It's there for our good. Note the disclaimer. Show restraint. You can only do it with his strength, and you will need it at times. Well, friends, I did say at the beginning it was going to be a slightly longer message tonight, but that's our introduction to Solomon's greatest song, his greatest love song ever. It's raw, it's steamy, it's passion. Why? Because love is as strong as death. And being so precious and volatile, it is no surprise we have this little book to teach us all about God's plan for true sexual intimacy. We're going to have a few moments to pause. We just have some quiet time between us and our God, us and the lover of our souls. It may well be some of us, we need to hear some of those lessons of the plain reading of the text, but for others, we need to let the allegorical seep in. And we need to be reminded that even tonight, God is tapping on our defenses, and he's wooing us. He's trying to get back into our lives.